What's up, y'all? Welcome to the Onyx Report's Black Masculinist News for the day. Hope you're well. Um, yeah, I wanted to take a little time to get this one a little more together. So, broadcasting a little later than I wanted to today, but I thought it was important because this has been an issue with me really since Michael Brown, but it was just a seed at that point. I couldn't articulate it until a couple of years ago. And I've just been seeing more and more evidence that, my suspicions about it are right in terms of what some of the overall goals seem to be with this organization. Highly problematic as it is. Anyway, like, share, subscribe, join, and donate. Support the channel if you will. There's plenty of ways to do so. You can see on the screen. You can do it, through Patreon. You can do it through PayPal. You can do it through Super Chat. But support the channel, all right? Hope you guys are well. So, today, as I'm sure you're well aware, we are going to deal with the recent report put out by Black Lives Matter about really their finances. Now, they're calling the report itself the 2020 Impact Report. But in it, right around between pages 20 to 23, you can see some of their statements about their finances. Now, this is not groundbreaking. They're really not showing a lot of the there's not a lot of transparency in my assessment. There really isn't. But just some of the general things, So let's look at a little bit of what they're talking about here. All right. So they begin. Now, this you can find on their website. Oh, man, I misplaced it. There it is, blacklivesmatter.com. And then there's a link for the 2020 Impact Report. I will try to remember to put those links in the description. If I don't, remind me. It'll take me half a second to do, and I'll make sure that they're in there for you. You just have to scroll down a little bit under the show description, and that's usually where I'll put the source links for what I'm talking about, right? But anyway, one of the first things they put up here is their by the numbers chart, right? And so in it, they say they raised $90 million in 2020. Average donation is about $30.64. More than 10% of donations were recurring. The breakdown, $8.4 million in operating expenses, $21.7 million in grants dispersed to more than 33 organizations, 23% of which, or 23, are led by LGBTQIA people and BLM chapters. 23% total assets dispersed compared to the industry average of 5 to 8%. Yeah. I'm going to get into a little bit of this. Now, this is, this is page 22 of their chart, right? Page 22. And one of the things you can see in it is where they're listing the organizations that they donated to. Now, keep in mind, they said they raised $90 million in 2020. That doesn't account for anything raised prior to 2020, by the way. But anyway, that said, as you can see, starting with the second sentence, this is what I want to highlight, right? As they say, obviously, well, I'll just read it from the first. In 2020, we selected 30 local organizations, not part of our grassroots apparatus, to be our first cohort of official BLM GNF grantees. As several communities were thrown into heightened political, socioeconomic, and medical vulnerabilities through COVID-19, BLM GNF sought to ensure the survival of some of the society's most vulnerable, namely Black LGBTQIA folks. Right? Of the 30 organizations listed, 23 of them are led by Black LGBTQIA folks and or directly serve these communities in places like Chicago, New York, New Jersey, DC, and Alabama. Our selected organizations are listed below. We have committed a 6-figure grant to each of these organizations. A 6-figure grant, right? And so they've identified, using intersectionality, right? They've calcified this theory to the point where now it's affecting actual resources that people have access to. And they've decided that this organization that's built off the lives of mainly dead heterosexual Black males, resources and the quote unquote ideological focus and leadership should go to LGBTQIF, QIA. This is what I meant when I was talking about a bait and switch, where they bait people's dollars, people's attention, people's emotion with black male death and switch to an agenda that has nothing to do with those black men that have died. And we allowed it to happen. We allowed it to happen. They talk about LGBTQIA folks as the most vulnerable. Where do they get that from? How do they establish that? Well, they don't establish it using any particular type of data. They establish it using intersectionality, because the theory rests on our common sense assumptions, right? If black people are oppressed more, then that's already a category. Well, if women are more oppressed than men, then women become the category. And if we assume that LGBTQIA is more oppressed than hetero, then and we add those categories together, and out of that calculus, we walk out with the most oppressed group, which is interesting. So I'm going to show you in a moment why that's problematic. So moving ahead a little bit. Okay. Go a little further. And it continues. BLM GNF also remains firmly committed to our grassroots network. After all, our movement was born at this level. And so they list the cities that they're going to support. And you get about 11 cities. So they've decided which cities are going to get support, and they go from there. Right after that, they state the total amount that's been committed to the 30 local organizations and BLM chapters is approximately 21.7 million. And they basically make the argument that, foundations typically grant between 5 to 8% of their assets, and they're actually donating or granting 23%. Ergo, they're doing more than any typical foundation. Well, most foundations do what I'm about to say, but they are doing more. Basically, in a poor community, resources of this magnitude are gentrifying gestures. What do I mean? I mean, they determine who has legs and who doesn't. It doesn't take much to do that in a poor community. It really doesn't. It really doesn't. You take this amount of money and you seed it to organizations that are, and I said this, on the last video I did on BLM. Black women in many ways have become the buffer class, particularly educated black women, right? Particularly, and this is articulated, in terms of the ideology by black feminism, but they become a buffer class in terms of middle class access, or at least the trappings of it, but institutional support that by and large black men don't get. So any successes black men have made are in spite of and not because of any kind of mainline institutional support, right? When you add in the intersectionality factor post 2015 with the rise of BLM, what you now have is a more calcified or crystallized group that is now receiving funding that is supposed to be addressing the issues of really black male death, and using those resources again to only support their own little intersectional group. Excuse me. So what I mean by gentrifying in that respect is that over time, we will start to see this, just like I talked about with Goldman Sachs and Visa and Google and MasterCard, all these corporations that are investing in black women and not men. When we saw grants last year determined during the pandemic to help entrepreneurs, while mom and pop businesses were falling apart left and right, those grants in the black community, they were never earmarked for black men. Ever. We talk about education, we look at the disparaging numbers that come out for black boys. There's no emphasis on black boys in any institutional capacity, right? I'm going to do a video soon on a mayor in her given city who is prioritizing black girls in education. Nobody's asking the question, do they actually need it? Because that's not politically correct. But if you actually look at the data, it's black boys who need it. And we're not allowed to say that, right? Because it's already been considered a sexist gesture. Ergo, we can justify ignoring it, even though it's black boys that need the help. And that hasn't changed. The only thing that's changed is that now that there are resources that Black folk have their hands on because of Black male death, the opportunity to use it in some kind of way that benefits boys is diminished. Yeah, I wanted to pull that particular article up. There it is. Yeah, Ayanna Pressley. Here, I wasn't planning to do this, but I might as well show you a little bit of it while we're here. Let's see if this will work. There we go. Yeah, it did. Right. Ayanna Pressley reintroduces bill to address disproportionate punishment of Black girls in schools. The numbers for Black boys are much higher. Right? But this is what you have. When you actually have the leadership in position, they advocate for themselves, even at the expense of the community. Because this was never about Black men and boys or, Black community. It was about Black women. And now Black LGBT. So, the impact of this is pretty hardcore. And what BLM is doing with these resources further entrenches the diminishment of focus on heterosexual Black men, even though they continue to be the ones that cause that gravitate, that engender this much attention. I mean, really, the 90 million we're talking about from last year is what? At the deaths of George Floyd. That was the one that kicked it all off. Wasn't the only one, but it was the major one because it was egregious and it was caught on camera. But it also has to do with frequency. We already know that the numbers of Black men and women killed by police are pretty extreme compared to other groups, right? For women, it's about 9 to 13. For men, it's about 200 to 300 per year. That 90 million didn't come for any other reason than how many Black men die. So let's just cut to it and say it for what it is, right? But meanwhile, while that's happening, what else is BLM doing? Well, this report came out not long ago about Patrisse Cullors. I talked about it before. I did a video that focused on how much money she's been spending on homes, but there's more than that going on. She's also spending on a number of other things. It's a report I found in dailymailcode.uk. BLM must stand for babes lounging in Malibu. Megyn Kelly leads those blasting Marxist leader Patrisse Cullors' jail reform group for spending $26,000 on meetings and appearances at luxury $1,200 a night resorts. Right, this came out April 27th. It was updated April 28th. A jail reform activist group found by the Marxist leader of the Black Lives Matter movement spent $26,000 for meetings and appearances at a luxury Malibu resort. Word. That's what we doing now? Okay. It continues. Reform LA jails, chaired by BLM founder Patrisse Cullors, paid $10,179 for meetings and appearances at the Calamigos Guest Ranch and Beach Club, and a further $15,000, nearly $600 at the Malibu Conference Center, which is owned by the resort between July and September 2019. A single night in a 2-bedroom cozy ranch chic suite in July cost $1,200, and guests at the 200-acre resort have access to a private 5-acre beach on the Malibu coast. Consulting firm co-founded by Cullors and her spouse and BLM co-founder Janaya Khan pulled in $191,000 during 2019 from Reform LA jails. That's what we're doing, or this is what we are allowing, right? So again, off of Black male death, Black male blood, you have an emphasis on privilege and access, but only for a certain group, namely Black women and Black LGBT, with an emphasis on trans women, right? Because it has to stay within women, in some way, shape, or form. That's the only way it seems to be acceptable. But when we look at charts like this, you know what? I'm going to focus on another one. I'm going to come back to this one. I'm going to focus on another one. Right? Because I wanted to ask the question, what are the percentage? And I presented some of this data last year, but I'm going to do it again. But I'm going to actually use the UCLA School of Law's Williams Institute site to answer some of the questions regarding what are the percentages we're talking about. If there's so much focus on Black LGBT, what are the kind of numbers we're looking at that justify sidestepping Black men to the extent they have been? Well, let's see. Let me just go straight to it. Here we go. All right. You got 1.4 million adults that identify as trans, right? Which is extremely low when you calculate it against the total population. Talking about 330 odd million Americans, whatever, I'm just ballparking it. You calculate the percentage of that, right? 0.08 of the adult population in certain states identify as transgender, namely Hawaii, California, Georgia, and New Mexico. 0.3 in other states like North Dakota, Iowa, Wyoming, Montana, and South Dakota. 0.7 of adults aged 18 to 24 identify as transgender. 0.5 of adults aged 65 and older identify as transgender. And of course, these numbers go up a bit when surveys are taken online. Got a lot of people who can take advantage of anonymity, but even if we took those numbers to be what they were at face value, they still change the impact. So let me go back to the other chart. I presented this one last year. And this is a chart that determined the number of people killed by police homicide from 2015 to 2019. What you can see in terms of Black women and Black men, right there on the screen, right? So we know the numbers range from 6 to 13 Black women. Now, the numbers also vary depending on the site you're using, right? So the Guardian site that counted had slightly higher numbers. I think it's the Washington Post. Yeah, their Fatal Force site, their numbers are a little lower, but it also, those have to do with definitions of or how they're defining the study that they're doing, what men it includes, what deaths and victims it includes, and which ones it doesn't. But as you can see, you still have a range of 2 to roughly 295 in 2015, right? Black men killed per year. But I decided to take it a little further and look at it. Now, as you can see in the sources, for number one, it says, according to a national epidemic, fatal anti-transgender violence in the U.S. in 2019, 3% of the total 20 to 26 annual transgender homicides across race per year are police initiated. 3%. Right? But didn't she say earlier that they were the most vulnerable group? Okay. It says in the past 8 years of data, they found an average of 20 to 30 murdered trans folk per year. They were mostly Black, under 30 in the Bible Belt, and born biologically male. Some reports suggest they mostly were involved in the sex industry. Only 3% were killed in police-initiated homicides. And to be clear, a good portion of that 3% were visibly perceived as male. But anyway, that's a whole nother conversation. It says there are 1 to 2 million more Black women than men out of the approximately 43 million Black folks, with 1.5 million missing Black men due to incarceration and early death. Gary J. Gates of UCLA's Williams Institute, a think tank that specializes in law and policy related to sexual orientation, he actually states, I'm skipping over a bit, that there are about 3.8% who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans, which is roughly about 9 million out of 328 million. So basically, when you're talking about trans folk, according to the very institute I named, you're looking at about 1.4 million that identify as trans, which is something like 0.6%. It's ridiculously small. And then there's about 3.8% altogether that identify as LGBT. And strangely, despite the numbers dying, they seem to be the most in need and therefore justify the most amount of resources. This is what's considered acceptable. This is ridiculous. I'm not saying that trans folk don't deserve support by any measure. I'm not arguing that. I'm not arguing that they're not human, that they're not vulnerable. I'm not arguing that they're just living it up with no problems. Not saying any of that. But I am saying when you build a movement that's built off of police homicide in the Black community, and you know Not only does it cost the lives of heterosexual black men more than any other group, but you built your movement off of it using pictures and video and actual protests around dead bodies, dead black male bodies laying in the street, and then take the resources from that. Shout out to Darren Seals and Nyota Uhuru out of Ferguson, who talk at length about the ways in which organizations like BLM, but mainly BLM, the formal organization itself, not the grassroots, larger scale movement of people who were just using the chant, but the actual organization participated in baiting and switching the issue and taking resources on the ground in Ferguson when Brown died, and continuing to do so up to this moment, all the way through George Floyd, all the way through 2021. And what we're seeing by private corporations, government, and BLM, which really is a private entity at this point, is the use of these resources to prioritize women and LGBT at the expense of heterosexual black men. And to say so is considered more of an atrocity than them actually doing it. So black men have to be quiet, bite their lip, while they find themselves gentrified out of the advancement of their own community into what promises to be middle-class access. Interesting. Do with it what you will, but I at least have to tell my brothers what's going on with it. I'd like to hear your comments. Let me know. I'm not interested in anything defamatory. I'm not interested in anything derogatory. I'm not trying to down talk anybody's gender, anyone's sexual orientation. That's not what this is about. The central issue at hand that I'm trying to bring to bear is the disparaging and the disparagement and the underdevelopment of black males at the expense of everyone else's agenda. We seem to be the sacrificial lambs that folks can use to dive off into elevated waters. You tell me, has there been any policies passed in the last 6 years that have prioritized black males and diminished police homicide, let alone any other type of vulnerability black males face? How many dollars have you seen allocated to this or to anything related to black males particularly? Feel free to let me know in the comments. All right, y'all. Peace.